All right, guys. Section two here. So, in the last one, we kind of explained what sociology is, that concept behind what they're trying to look at. And so today, we want to get at the kind of the history of sociology, the origins of sociology, uh, why it started, who were the players in this, and what were some of their thoughts, and how it's evolved a little bit into some of the 19th, 20th century, and maybe some 21st century thinkers in the field of sociology. All right. So, objective today, after kind of viewing this, you should be able to explain the contributions of the major pioneers of sociology. Like I said, I'll introduce you to those figures and kind of those ideas, and we'll eventually get to how these have evolved into present day thoughts and ideas in the field of sociology. All right. So, let's take a look at this and think about or when it started and why it would have started it. So if you look at the European origins of sociology, it happens during the French and Industrial Revolutions, where it kind of evolves, and you see society moving from the farm life to factory life. And so what happens is as things change, okay, the lifestyle of what was farm life, and it moves to factory life, you have a lot of things changing. So type of work, all right, the livelihood of individuals, all right, concentrated areas of poverty in some of these cities, okay, that were run rampant with different things, okay, whether it be disease to the mixing of cultures to several different things that started to change the way that people lived. And so as the way people live changed, um, people are going to want to start to kind of take a look at that. So what did they want to do? They wanted to bring back a sense of community and to restore order, because during this time, as much as it's huge into where we are present day, it was somewhat chaotic. Okay, and so that chaos created a lot of different things. In regards to restoring order, what did that actually mean to restore order? All right, restore order back to what? To a calmer, more peaceful lifestyle. That's some of the things we're going to look at, and what they truly wanted to do, because their intentions originally were interesting to take a look at. So let's take a look at some of these individuals, these early ones, with their ideas. So the first one's going to be Comte. So obviously you see here French Revolution, Industrial Revolution time, and one of these earlier pioneers in his train of thought. And he was French, and he is considered the father of sociology. Why? Because he actually coined the term sociology. All right, and his concern was to improve society from what if you talk about living during the French Revolution, and then into the Industrial Revolution, he wanted to improve it from the chaotic environment it was in. And he comes up with this idea called positivism. And I don't want you to think of positivism as this way of thinking things are good, like positive as opposed to negative, but positive in the sense of making sure that we are sure of something, okay, that we're positive about something. So it's the idea, I'm positive that Billy mowed the lawn. I saw him do it, okay? So that idea is where the term positive comes from. So what he wants to do is apply the scientific approach to the social world to make sure that we can be positive about the things that are going on, okay? So applying science to society. And you can see where, if you remember from section one, that's kind of the idea behind sociology, all right? And he distinguished between social statics and social dynamics, the difference being statics studying stability, while if something's dynamic, it's studying the social change. And he believed that studying sociology could promote social progress, all right? So there you go. That is Comte and his early thoughts. Next is going to be Herbert Spencer. Okay, now Spencer is an interesting individual, and here are some of the reasons why. We'll go to Marx here in a second. So a little bit of background, he's the sole survivor of 9 children, which, losing children back in that time with different disease and whatnot is not completely uncommon, but being one of 9 is. But he compares the human body to society. And so what's he saying here? Okay, so what does this actually mean? And for you to be fully functioning as a human, okay, you like to be all of your parts functioning, whether from the brain to your arms and your legs, okay? And if one of those parts is not working, all right, other parts are either going to have to make up for it, or you as a human being are kind of going to struggle in the area of, I mean, if you're missing both of your legs, there are certain things that you won't be able to do. All right. So, like I said, you're going to have to compensate for that with different things with your arms and your mind and other things that you can do. But at the end of the day, walking will not be something that that individual could do. Okay. So he applies this idea to society in that all parts need to be working well for it to function well. So he's saying like educational institutions, religious institutions, all right, the economy, all of these need to be working cohesively together for it to be functioning well. If there's dysfunction in the in one area, it could cause dysfunction in others, or that other area needs to kind of help out to make things function better. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you. He introduces this theory of social Darwinism, not Darwinism in itself, or Darwin, but this idea of survival of the fittest in society. And this is where you're going to have not only myself, but others kind of question a little bit of where he goes with this. But he talks about the idea of the poor deserve to be poor and the rich deserve to be rich. Just hearing that at face, obviously you kind of step back and say, whoa, wait a second, what are we getting at here? All right. And it's pretty clear what this is. And he's actually, so he's welcomed to the United States when he wants to visit. He comes to America in the late 1800s, like 1882-ish, 85-ish, somewhere around there, if I can recollect the year. But who is he welcomed by in the United States? It's going to be corporate leaders. Okay. Why is this? Because his ideas and what he's writing about gives them some moral justification for maybe some of the things that are going on in the United States at that time in regards to, look at the statement, the poor deserve to be poor, the rich deserve to be rich. They're going to champion his ideas, okay, with this survival of the fittest. So he's going to rule out a lot of the circumstances that, play a role in why somebody might be poor. And he's going to say if they don't take it upon themselves, they deserve to be poor and the rich deserve to be rich. Okay, which that train of thought is not something that's completely lost upon American society now. Okay, it's something that is still brought up. And it's something that we'll bring up, especially when we start to talk about social stratification in the United States. Next is Karl Marx. All right, I'm assuming most of you have heard of Karl Marx and Marxism. All right, he is German. He is concerned, okay, for poverty in the working class. And he helps write the Communist Manifesto with Engels. All right, and they talk about two social classes, the bourgeoisie, all right, and the proletariat, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie they own the means for producing wealth, while the proletariat work for the bourgeoisie. All right, so those that own the means for producing wealth, we're talking about your business owners. All right, somebody came up with a good question once. If that term is where, if somebody says somebody's bougie, does that come from that? It's a good question. I have no idea. Somebody look that up and put it in the chat or something so that I can find out. But anyway, back to this. And in the proletariat, those are your workers, your working class in society, maybe a little what they would consider then at that point in time lower class, considered to those that are business owners. But he said the two classes themselves, the way that it was structured at that time, is going to eventually lead to class conflict. All right? And the result would be a classless society. So as these two kind of classes go at it, eventually this would lead to a classless society. All right. Now his writings, this is what's going to lead to a lot of, are going to be adopted when we get in to the influence that it has on workers' revolutions. Okay. Think of, if you guys remember studying the Russian Revolution your freshman year. All right. And we know this is a very difficult. The idea of a classless society is something that is not truly obtainable, because we're going to break up into different ways. We often break up our classes, but strictly off of money. Typically, when we talk about working poor or the working class or the 1%, we add in all demographics to that, but that whole pyramid is based off of your earnings and your wealth. Okay, we'll get into that a little bit obviously later too, but just want to bring up how this was introduced and who it was introduced by. Next, we want to look at Durkheim. All right, Durkheim is French, and he says that society is going to exist because of broad consensus, and he's going to talk about what is known as social integration. And what is this? All right, the degree to which members of a group or a society feel united by shared values and other social bonds. All right, this is also referenced as social cohesion. All right, so he talks about this in the realm of pre-industrial societies and industrial societies. In pre-industrial societies, you had what was known as mechanical solidarity. And mechanical solidarity is the consensus of values and beliefs, all right? Which, when you have this consensus of values and beliefs, people will conform, all right? And people become more dependent on tradition and family. And that should make sense in the idea of a pre-industrial society. So back to that early farming, smaller community idea. Industrial societies are going to have more organic solidarity, where the interdependence is based on high degree of specialization in roles. And so the members of this society are going to be dependent on each other for goods and services. So bankers are going to need customers, and people are going to need banks. So as we move into more industrialized societies in the time that these guys were around, they're going to realize that, as opposed to kind of the smaller community where different people can do certain things, you're going to go to a community in an industrial society. You're going to work this job that's going to provide a specific service or product, and you're going to be dependent upon a lot of others to do those same things, so that we can all function together. And that's that idea of organic solidarity. All right. And everybody had their specialization in different roles. Once again, we'll kind of expand on this as time moves on. Next is Max Weber. All right, he's German. All right, and he says that humans act on the basis of their own understanding. All right, so what we know, we attach personal meanings and beliefs and attitudes, and where does this come from? All right, we know what we know based off of what we've lived. All right, and we see the world on how we understand it, which could be completely different from somebody from a different state, a different community, all right, a different race, a different creed, whatever it may be. All right, and he says we need to apply this idea of verstehen, which at the end of the day, what this really is if you guys are familiar with the term empathy, is kind of what this is. And he says we need to put ourselves mentally in someone else's place and see from their point of view. Probably something that you've been asked to do, maybe by a parent, a teacher, a guardian of some sort, say you got to see it from their perspective, okay? Because we oftentimes have tunnel vision when we think about things. And this is something that Weber talked about. All right. And he also brings up the idea of rationalization. Pretty easy concept to kind of grasp. You guys would probably have an idea what this is already. It's mindset emphasizing knowledge, reason, and planning. So this, what we know, and we want to apply knowledge, we want to apply basic reasoning, and we want to plan things out when kind of functioning as an individual and as a society. All right. So if you think of farming based on, let's go back to this, is most of it is actually based on science. Okay. While before we had kind of the scientific revolution and the agricultural revolution, which are similar in terms of time frame, they used to, maybe throw their seeds out and then, say a couple of prayers maybe and hope that they'd have a good crop yield. And and they started to realize that this isn't the best way to maybe do this. And as science kind of takes off and the agricultural revolution takes off, they realize that there's a method to this. So this is when you're getting introduction of like crop rotation. They're going to plant seeds at different levels within the earth to get a better yield. All right, they're going to put in, like now with a lot of fields, though, they may rotate soybeans and corn so that there's nutrients left in the soil. All right. So it's the idea of being rational when we do things. All right. Emphasizing knowledge and reason. And this can go well beyond, obviously, farming. It can be in decision making. It can be in how our economy functions. Okay. Where we apply some of these things when making these decisions. What's the problem with rationalization? All right. People are irrational. Okay, at the end of the day, we do irrational things. We still use some different thought processes that might not lead us into. Okay, let's think of this COVID, right? Why you guys are home right now. How many different points of view and how many different ideas have you heard about how this should be handled? And it's made you probably question so many different things. All right. Some of you are probably set in stone of how the best way to go about this, the worst way to go about this. And you have different sides, tugging at you, telling you what's good, what's bad. And it becomes, we're not on nobody is. And it's not necessarily does anybody need to be exactly on the same page. There's going to be opposing views, but it makes it sometimes hard to function. It makes us more dysfunctional. COVID-19 has probably made us more dysfunctional as a society as we try to navigate through this. No matter what side you're on with it, that's something that is true. All right, now let's look at Martineau. We're going to get into a little bit of some females, all right, and some women that played a role in sociology and some of the hurdles that they had to kind of battle just being a woman. So she's an English woman. A little bit of background on her. She loses some of her senses before she reaches adulthood. And so the family business that she was a part of, that collapses, changes her economic standing. So she needs to find ways to support herself. She becomes a pioneer for many feminist theories. She makes the linkage between slavery and the oppression of women. Those of you know a little bit of the history of that, even in the United States. You look at some of those that, like the Seneca Falls Convention, some of those early pioneers of women, they would oftentimes work with African Americans at the time. Sometimes they didn't work well together. Sometimes they did, okay, in trying to link their causes when trying to expand on the freedoms and liberties that they would have. She becomes an advocate for the emancipation, okay, of both the oppression of women and slavery early on, okay? All right, so let's move. We looked at this with the European origins, which would transfer over into the United States, and I even applied some U.S. thought to this. So let's talk about when this first pops up. First sociology department is going to be established at the University of Chicago. All right, it's going to be in a lot of Ivy League schools to start, some Midwestern colleges, as that's kind of the hotbed of kind of, you have that Eastern Seaboard of the Ivy League, and then the Midwestern, some of your early schools are going to be in even Ohio, okay? But after World War II and some of the issues that arise after World War II, you're going to see a lot more sociology departments start popping up, all right? And we want to talk about, speaking of Chicago, we want to talk about Jane Addams, all right? If you've never heard of her, all right, she founded the Hull House in the slums of Chicago, and these became a refuge for immigrants, sick, poor, elderly, all right, and this was one of Chicago's largest not-for-profit or nonprofit organizations. This current house right here is a museum, and there's over 40 sites of Hull houses still around Chicago to this day. All right. And what she would do with these is she would invite sociologists to the Hull houses to witness the effects of industrialization on the poor. All right. And see what was happening. You look at how industrialized, I mean, still a little bit today, but especially Chicago as kind of that rail yard central and a lot of industrialization happening there in terms of shipping, and whether it be the lake or whether it be, like I said, the railroads. Um, and so she said, let's take a look at what this is doing. All right. And she becomes very active in women's suffrage, all right, and peace movements. And she would actually be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. All right. And she was an inspiration for, if you're familiar with Eleanor Roosevelt's work in promoting women's rights, she was kind of a big inspiration for Eleanor Roosevelt in her work in the 30s and 40s. All right, let's move to W.E.B. Du Bois. All right. He's from Massachusetts, was an African-American educator. He's born during Reconstruction, so that post-Civil War time. I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard of him, but he's pretty iconic for several different things that he did. He helps found the NAACP, and he uses sociology, right? So think about what sociology is. He's going to use that to disprove a lot of racist assumptions. And at the end of the day, more broadly, mainly that African Americans were an inferior race. He's going to talk about a lot of the conditions and the different things. And obviously, him being born during Reconstruction, he understands that plight of how even in a quote unquote post-slavery America, at least on paper, of what that looked like and how difficult that became. And not the idea of them being an inferior race, but the idea of how those circumstances are playing a huge role. He wrote many scholarly works. I got to read The Souls of Black Folk in college, which is a fantastic read, by the way. And he's got some really great ideas in there. But that was one of his early works that kind of dealt with sociology. Something interesting about him, too, is he actually helped fund the Princeton chapter of the NAACP. And who he did that with actually was Albert Einstein, which is interesting in itself. And that's where Einstein would, if you've ever seen the phrase where Einstein says that racism is America's worst disease. All right. And obviously that's something that is prevalent today and something that we'll discuss as we move on here in the course. All right. So last one we're going to talk about here is Ida B. Wells. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with Ida B. Wells. Once again, she becomes a prominent journalist, an activist, and she does a lot of research in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then we're going to take a look at here what she looked at. She shed the light on the conditions of African Americans throughout the South, okay, as she witnessed it herself. One of her friends was lynched. And so she started to look at what was going on in the South when you talk about white mob violence. So when we talk about her friends being lynched, 3 of her friends were lynched for they owned it was a black owned grocery store in the South, and they ended up being lynched, and they were very successful. And the reason, as what she found, one of the core reasons behind the lynching itself was the economic threat of a successful black business to the rival white-owned grocery store at that time in the South. And so she started to kind of take a look at that. And she did some work on this being the source of several different lynchings, as the idea of the success of African Americans in the South and how that was a threat to those doing the lynching, which, oh, shoot, I forgot. Hang on one second here. I want to show you this quick video. This is an interesting one. I'm going to pop this up, and hopefully this plays for you guys here.
In March of 1892, 3 black grocery store owners in Memphis, Tennessee, were murdered by a mob of white men. Lynchings like these were happening all over the American South, often without any subsequent legal investigation or consequences for the murderers. But this time, a young journalist and friend of the victims set out to expose the truth about these killings. Her reports would shock the nation and launch her career as an investigative journalist, civic leader, and civil rights advocate. Her name was Ida B. Wells. Ida Bell Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862, several months before the Emancipation Proclamation released her and her family. After losing both parents and a brother to yellow fever at the age of 16, she supported her 5 remaining siblings by working as a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. During this time, she began working as a journalist. Writing under the pen name Iola, by the early 1890s, she gained a reputation as a clear voice against racial injustice and became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. She had no shortage of material. In the decades following the Civil War, Southern whites attempted to reassert their power by committing crimes against Black people, including suppressing their votes, vandalizing their businesses, and even murdering them. After the murder of her friends, Wells launched an investigation into lynching. She analyzed specific cases through newspaper reports and police records, and interviewed people who had lost friends and family to lynch mobs. She risked her life to get this information. As a Black person investigating racially motivated murders, she enraged many of the same Southern white men involved in lynchings. Her bravery paid off. Most whites had claimed and subsequently reported that lynchings were responses to criminal acts by Black people. But that was not usually the case. Through her research, Wells showed that these murders were actually a deliberate, brutal tactic to control or punish Black people who competed with whites. Her friends, for example, had been lynched when their grocery store became popular enough to divert business from a white competitor. Wells published her findings in 1892. In response, a white mob destroyed her newspaper presses. She was out of town when they struck, but they threatened to kill her if she ever returned to Memphis. So she traveled to New York, where that same year she republished her research in a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In 1895, after settling in Chicago, she built on Southern Horrors in a longer piece called The Red Record. Her careful documentation of the horrors of lynching and impassioned public speech got national attention. Wells used her newfound fame to amplify her message. She traveled to Europe, where she rallied European outrage against racial violence in the American South, in hopes that the U.S. government and public would follow their example. Back in the U.S., she didn't hesitate to confront powerful organizations, fighting the segregationist policies of the YMCA and leading a delegation to the White House to protest discriminatory workplace practices. She did all of this while disenfranchised herself. Women didn't win the right to vote until Wells was in her late 50s, and even then, the vote was primarily extended to white women only. Wells was a key player in the battle for voting inclusion, starting a Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. But in spite of her deep commitment to women's rights, she clashed with white leaders of the movement. During a march for women's suffrage in Washington, D.C., she ignored the organizers' attempt to placate Southern bigotry by placing Black women in the back and marched up front alongside the white women. She also chafed with other civil rights leaders who saw her as a dangerous radical. She insisted on airing, in full detail, the atrocities taking place in the South, while others thought doing so would be counterproductive to negotiations with white politicians. Although she participated in the founding of the NAACP, she was soon sidelined from the organization. Wells' unwillingness to compromise any aspect of her vision of justice shined a light on the weak points of the various rights movements, and ultimately made them stronger, but also made it difficult for her to find a place within them. She was ahead of her time, waging a tireless struggle for equality and justice, decades before many had even begun to imagine it possible. If you were inspired by Ida B. Wells' fight for equality, check out this playlist for more videos about influential women throughout history.
All right. So let me hang on here. Okay, so interesting video. Hopefully you found that interesting. There's a lot there to unpack, but a lot of work being done by Miss Wells there. So interesting to say the least. So this was already covered in the video, and it was something that we already talked about. And it said that she was at the Niagara Falls for the founding of the NAACP, although her name is not mentioned as an official founder. So just kind of that tag of being a woman kind of holding her back, even in some of the progress that she was trying to make. And it talked about that at her even marching in D.C. in that famed march where she kind of said, you know what, I'm coming right up front. So, all right, so here's going to be your assignment, and it's attached to this. All right, you're going to write a paragraph. We're going back to Max Weber, trying to work on my German there. Concept of Verstehen, or empathy, applies to a recent situation you felt you were being wronged. So what I'm going to ask you to do is basically get in the mind of, so let's say, think about the last disagreement you had with somebody. All right. So let's say that I had a disagreement with my wife. Let's make something up here. I promise I'm making this up. She's mad that I didn't do the dishes the night before. All right. I'm going to write this paragraph as if I'm my wife, explaining why she is mad at me. So I would write it like, I can't believe Mr. Nedgedly. She doesn't call me Mr. Nedgedly. I can't believe Mr. Nedgedly wouldn't do the dishes last night. He didn't understand how busy I was. So I'm writing from her perspective, trying to understand where she came from, trying to get inside of her head when write this. Okay. So that's kind of how this is going to work. If you have any questions, let me know. But get that done and get it